if you take the whole pile of dollars in the world and you take the whole pile of goods in the world and you say, these goods are worth this many dollars. Well, when that pile of dollars gets a lot bigger, right, then each dollar in that pile buys fewer goods.
Right.
So that's the basic challenge of inflation, is that your currency is worth less. It buys fewer goods. And with the amount of money printing that's gone on, especially in the last 10, 12 years, that's a big issue. And, everybody thought it would come home to roost a lot sooner than this.
Ladies and gentlemen, farmers, ranchers, and distinguished guests, thank you for listening to the Farm for Profit podcast, where we discuss the latest ideas, methods, trends, and techniques available to help your farm achieve higher levels of farm profitability. The Farm for Profit podcast is co-hosted by Tanner Winterhoff, the Iowa Bankerman, and David Whitaker, the Iowa Land Guy, where in tandem they will share their ideas and advice from industry experts. Thank you again for listening to the Farm for Profit podcast. Remember, if you aren't farming for profit, you won't be farming for long. And now, here's Tanner and David.
Hey, listeners, welcome back to the Farm for Profit podcast. This is Tanner Winterhoff.
And this is David Whitaker.
We picked up a lot of new listeners most recently, so just to remind you, I am an ag banker by career. Dave, what do you do?
And I am a real estate agent and auctioneer, primarily selling farmland across Iowa.
Awesome. And you guys are here on a Farm for Profit show today. We have two kind of different formats. We call them Farm for Profit and Farm for Fun. So we're going to hit a What's Working in Ag segment and then a general topic. The next episode in your queue or next week is Farm for Fun, where we get to meet some really cool people in agriculture.
And Tanner, we always love the suggestions from our audience. If you guys have if you have any topics to suggest, make sure you email them to farm4profitllc@gmail.com, and you can find us on any kind of social media.
That's right. Listener reviews, because we love those also, Dave. Don't be afraid to leave those behind, even if they're good or bad. No, we just want the good ones. Yeah, just the good ones.
Any of them.
But They're brought to you today by BW Fusion. They're combining the best-in-class products along with their 365 soil and tissue program to provide you, the grower, the tools and resources necessary to identify those limiting factors and address them to boost the ROI. This was a fun one, Dave. So this came across Ag Twitter, and this is a review from Oren Nussbaum. He met one of our favorite guests, Vance Crowe, in the middle of the desert. So Vance said, in the middle of the desert, Oren never misses a Farm for Profit episode.
There you go. I like it.
They're everywhere, Dave. Just like the eyes in the skies. They're everywhere.
Yep.
But no, thank you so much for those listener reviews. Also, don't forget about Gearinghoff. Gearinghoff is head of the class no matter the crop. But that is enough for the ads today, Dave. Why don't you introduce our guest today for What's Working in Ag?
So what's working in ag? Of course, we want to know what's working. Mike Downey with Next Generation Ag Advocates is on the line with us today. Welcome, Mike.
Yeah, good afternoon. Happy to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you. Listeners, Mike grew up on a family grain and livestock farm in west central Illinois and near Roseville, I believe. Received an agriculture business and finance from the University of Illinois in 2000. Began a career land management and real estate with Hertz Farm Management. Hey, I used to work for him too.
Oh, is that where I hit the boo key?
Boo, and was responsible for a 7-county area in eastern Iowa, western Illinois. He has since joined Farm Financial Strategies to pursue his interest in helping farm families and landowners with their estate planning strategies and transitioning land to the next generation. Again, welcome, Mike. What did we miss in your intro? Are you married, kids? Where do you live now?
You bet. No, live in eastern Iowa. My first job from Champaign-Urbana brought me to Mount Vernon, where I'm still at today. As you mentioned, my first job was with Hertz. I thought, like a lot of folks out there in the ag industry, all I wanted to do was farm growing up. I just didn't have the opportunity. So my first job brought me to Mount Vernon. I since became acquainted with Steve Bohr with Farm Financial Strategies, who has met with my folks and our family and took an interest in that area. So still there today, have a family, 8-year-old, 5-year-old, and things have kind of come full circle. In the spring and the fall, when I'm not busy helping farm families, I'm actually helping my wife's cousin on their family farm in the spring and the fall. We recently bought a farm of ourselves about a year ago, so we get to trade the labor for the equipment and get to enjoy that. Keeps me in tune, and it's also therapeutic.
So, Mike, one of the things you do is Century Match, and that's what's working in ag today. Tell me about it.
So Century Match is basically the whole vision of putting together next gen ag, which is kind of founded by two farmers here in Iowa. One of those is Steve Bohr. The other one is Glenn Moeller over by the Quad Cities. He retired in 2015 after 40 years of farming, raising hogs. Didn't have a successor, just like 68% of other farmers don't have children that farm. He was one of those. And another half of those have not identified a successor. And he was the brainchild, and he and Steve came to me shortly after I joined Steve with Farm Financial and said, hey, we have this idea, and the three of us teamed up and put that together, and that's what we're trying to do. The whole overlying concern is, trying to keep farms in our community, because every time a farm is sold or transitions outside, it's going to be a lot more difficult to bring that back. So just trying to transition in a responsible way, introduce some young producers to retiring farmers like Glenn. That's also grown into just helping existing operations team up and collaborate and be more efficient, working with the same line of machinery and so forth.
I think that's the biggest reason we've got you on, is this is an out-of-the-box approach to connect people that aren't blood to make sure that the farm continues. So one of those ways, obviously you guys probably work with leasing programs. Is that something that you help with?
Sure. Well, yeah, that's one of the most difficult questions we get is about the equipment. How do we transition this? Because if you go to your tax guy, oftentimes that's pretty dooming news when you see you might give half of that away in state and federal income tax when you line up the machinery. So we like to think if we can get it in front of 5 retiring farmers, maybe 3 out of the 5 will consider, something outside the box. Like, what if we can introduce them to a young producer who's maybe not farming, or even one that's part of a family farm. They just need to bring more acres to the operation. And one of those strategies, Tanner, is kind of more of a lease to own arrangement, which tends to be more tax efficient for both sides, kind of a win-win, almost like the retiring farmer playing John Deere or Case IH as the one leasing the equipment.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm sure when you're trying to put all pieces of the package together, you fit into a little bit of an advisory role. Is that right?
Yeah. So we tell folks right up front, we're not an attorney. We're not attorneys. We're not accountants. We're consultants. Many of us farm ourselves, but we just work with, 50 or 60 families every year. So we see all kinds of things that work well. And unfortunately, we also see some things that don't work so well. And we just try to leverage those experiences to help others. And there's a lot of folks out there that want to do some planning. They just don't know where to go, where to start, what the options are. So just helping families kind of work through what those different options are to help them find the one that works best for them.
That's one thing we talk about as any ag professional is land stewardship, and you guys are going a step farther, not just land stewardship, but I'm going to say farming stewardship, the legacy of farming. So, well, we appreciate you being on here. Give us your contact information, Mike, if people want to know more about Century Match.
You bet. Our website is nextgenag.us. You can find more about our different programs, and certainly look me up if you want to send me an email as well.
That's one landowner, one producer, and one farm at a time.
I like that. Yes. Thanks so much, Mike, for joining us. Listeners, we're going to transition right here into our general topic for today. They're minimizing risks on your farm, helping you improve your yields, and increasing your profit margins. In today's farming operations, the data is the key to achieving all of this, Dave.
It's no secret that data has been helping more and more farmers gain ground in their operation, and there's no better way to manage all of that data than through John Deere's Operations Center. As a leading farm management platform, John Deere is constantly and continuously fine-tuning the features in Operations Center to make it easier, faster for you to analyze all of that farm data.
Yeah, and within that Operations Center, you can collect and analyze all of your machine, field, and crop data year after year, so you can make those data-driven decisions for your operation. You can set up field instructions for your machine operators, then push those instructions directly to that in-cab display straight from that Operations Center. Then your operators don't have to enter this information when they get to the field.
That is so cool. And with near real-time monitoring with the Operations Center, you can track the machine performance, the field work, and stay ahead of all the logistics to ensure the right work is being done at the right time. With all that yield data in Operations Center, you can analyze your total farm operations performance and make any changes for an even better next year.
And John Deere continues to make their Operations Centers your go-to place to gain ground in your operation. It's free to use. Just create an account at operationscenter.deere.com or download the mobile apps from the Apple app or Google Play stores. You can also see your local John Deere dealer for more information. Thank you to John Deere for being a proud partner of the Farm for Profit podcast.
And Tanner, that's a great what's working in ag. And now to our main topic, which is a topic I'm going to say is all over the news right now. I've considered it myself that it's happening, and that's inflation. Mm-hmm. And so who's our guest? What do we got?
You bet. We have Dr. Richard Smith. He's known as the Doctor of Uncertainty by his peers. Dr. Smith has dedicated his life to comprehending the market risk and empowering traders, both new and seasoned, to be savvy investors. He's also been the author of Risk Rituals newsletter, which offers investment advice on how we can be more successful. Dave, that's what we're here for.
You bet.
In a risk-based world. He also serves as the CEO of the historic research nonprofit, the Foundation for the Study of Cycles. Dr. Smith is an expert. He's shared his commentary that has been featured on Business Insider, MarketWatch, Forbes, CNN Business, Newsweek, Money, CNET, and more. Dave, I don't know if we could have found someone more qualified to talk inflation. Welcome, Dr. Smith.
It's great to be here, guys. Looking forward to it.
So what, give us just a little bit, there's your resume. What's a little bit about you? Just family, kids, where do you live? What do you do?
Yeah, I live in Southwest Virginia, just off the Blue Ridge Mountain Parkway. So in Blue Ridge Mountains, kind of outside of Christiansburg, Blacksburg area. Virginia Tech is big out here. And moved out to the mountains a couple of years ago now, and actually live on some land, have about 100 acres here. Have a neighbor partner who runs some cattle on my land. My family and I wanted to kind of get out of the city and get back to something a little more sane. But background is in finance. I developed some websites that helped retail investors and traders be smarter about their investment decisions. And I got a PhD in math, essentially, and I teach people about the mathematics of risk, and then also kind of the behavioral side of risk, behavioral psychology, which I think is really underestimated. It's really the huge elephant in the room and missing link, I think, in most people being more successful in their financial lives. And then I also see the world has become much more financial over the last 20 years, right? And I see the whole kind of technology, digital media space as being largely financialized and having gone a little bit too far, or even a lot too far, you know? And so it's something that I try to educate people about, understand that world better, and then also encourage everybody to, you know, not forget about the real things in life, like our families and growing food, and you know,
well, that's a big
not
part
just
of
spending all our lives on our screens.
That's a big part of our audience. They are getting more screens in their tractors, but of course, Farm for Profit podcast. Most of our listeners here, Dr. Smith, are going to be farmers that are kind of back to the roots. Of course, Midwest, but all across the world, of course, but. All of our people that listen, I'm going to say have one thing in common, and that is most everybody would have financial risk of some sort, Tanner. Yeah. There is a lot of risk in farming to where I'm going to say most of society doesn't understand how much risk there is. It's a lot of money moving, and money's made in the margins, and there's just a very little bit that comes out for the farmer in the end. Mm-hmm. But so this whole inflation topic is really going to hit home with a lot of our listeners.
Yeah, so for the basics to begin with, what is inflation, Dr. Smith?
Inflation is basically when you get more money in the system that makes the current money in the system worth less, right? So we have a certain amount of dollars in our bank accounts, but when the government is printing money and increasing the money supply, increasing the amount of dollars out there, your dollars are worth less, right? Because if you take the whole pile of dollars in the world, and you take the whole pile of goods in the world and you say, these goods are worth this many dollars. Well, when that pile of dollars gets a lot bigger, right, then each dollar in that pile buys fewer goods.
Right.
So that's the basic challenge of inflation, is that your currency is worth less. It buys fewer goods. And with the amount of money printing that's gone on, especially in the last 10, 12 years, that's a big issue. And, everybody thought it would come home to roost a lot sooner than this, but it's definitely come home to roost now.
So where are we now? What are we looking at right now as we record this here towards the end of January 2022?
Inflation is on the rise. I think the latest numbers out were like 7% annualized inflation, biggest inflation we've had in 40 years. It's a really serious thing. It's a really scary thing. I don't think it's transitory. I think it's here to stay. I think it's going to continue to increase. And the main reason I think it's going to continue to increase is because, one of the biggest debtors in the world is our government, right? The federal government. And they can't afford to have that debt get away from them, okay? Interest rates are going up now. We've seen sea changes in interest rates, including long-term interest rates, really coming up off of 40-year lows, right? Some historic bottoms. In my involvement and as the chairman and CEO of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, this is something that we look at closely. And we're convinced that we are at, a major 40-year low in the interest rate cycle, right? So long-term interest rates are going up. That's bad for the government being able to afford its debt, right? So the other way to make sure that the government can continue to afford its debt is to have inflation go up faster than interest rates are going to go up, right? So that's called real rates, right? The difference between inflation and the amount of interest that you're earning, that's still negative right now. And I think it's probably going to be negative for some time. And you're going to see inflation rise and interest rates rise. And I think it is a huge narrative and psychological change for everybody who's got financial decisions to make.
So, Dr. Smith, you said cycles. You're the CEO of that. I'm lost a little bit. What is cycles? Help me understand what the organization is and what you do with that and how that helps me as a farmer.
Yeah, absolutely. So cycles are a fact of life. Farmers know that better than anyone, right? Even the simple seasonal cycles. But there are bigger cycles that have shown up over and over again in data over the years. So you can certainly look at agricultural cycles. You can look at cycles in the prices of corn, wheat, soybeans, et cetera, right? And a lot of people look to the Foundation for the Study of Cycles for insights like that. But you can also look at cycles in terms of financial futures, interest rates, stock market, et cetera. I've been saying for a while, I think we're at the top of a stock market cycle right now. And these are mostly done through what's called digital signal processing, right? So it's the math basically that looks in the data and looks for the patterns that fit the data, the cycle patterns, and then tries to assess, find the ones that are most statistically significant, okay? So we look at that in the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, and it's basically looking at time and price data over time, and then studying the cycles in that data.
So it's not just one item that controls these cycles. It's a lot of things put together. It's consumer activity, it's a pandemic, it's a government policy. So that's interesting. I'm glad that you elaborated it on that.
Let's back up. We talked about what inflation is. What are contributory factors that are causing inflation? You said we're at a historic low. I mentioned 40 years, and that we're on the rise. What's causing inflation at its roots? I mean, you said it's money goes up, and we have a pile of money here and a pile of product here, and we have more money than we have products, so yet our dollar's worth less. What are some of the contributory factors that have caused us to go historically low and then back up?
Well, I think that there's been a lot of engineering, financial engineering in the economy, right? Ever since, say, the financial crisis, but even going all the way back to Alan Greenspan and, in the early 2000s and, the 9/11 attacks and the market crash around then, there's been a lot of intervention in the markets by governments, to the point that even the likes of Ray Dalio, one of the biggest hedge fund managers in the world, saying, we don't have free markets anymore. So there's been just tremendous government intervention in the markets. Now they talk about what's called the Fed put, right? Have you ever heard that one? So that means the Federal Reserve and the government don't want the stock market to crash, right? So if it crashes, that's bad for psychology. People have got their pension funds in 401ks, et cetera. So there's a lot of intervention in the markets right now for political and economic reasons. Okay. So that has created a lot of artificial forces in the markets. I was just reading earlier how something like over 50% of the gains in the stock market over the past 10 years are attributable to Federal Reserve interventions in the market and not to actual, increased earnings by businesses. That wasn't true before 2010, before the financial crisis, right? So you had much more real growth in the economy, but right now we don't have real growth in the economy. We have tremendous money printing. We have tremendous liquidity that doesn't know where to go. Asset prices are getting inflated, right? Everything's crazy expensive. You look at some of the stuff that's gone on with technology stocks that are now down 50% or more, right? Because really there wasn't real value there, right? It was all a speculative bubble, or largely a speculative bubble, right? So now inflation has arisen, right? The Federal Reserve doesn't have the same wiggle room that it used to, because they can't let inflation get out of control. So they can't just keep printing. So now, they're between a rock and a hard place. So what has gotten us to where we are is the printing, all of the intervention, not letting the natural cycles of the markets unfold and correct, right? And so, that's why there's a bigger risk today of the mother of all corrections, because that correction has been put off for at least 12 years, if not 20 years. Now with inflation, really picking up, the Federal Reserve can't keep printing. They got to start tightening. But they're in a tricky position. And I think that's going to lead to a lot of volatility and a lot of, challenges for most of the people who don't understand all this stuff.
Right. And I would say our listeners are a big advocate for understanding that there is not a real free market anymore. I think no matter what sector our listeners are in, whether it's livestock, between the beef, the swine, the poultry industry, or the crops, certainly feels like there's a lot more intervention, or manipulation is maybe another word.
Well, I was just going to say, I tell folks all the time. So, Dr. Smith, I sell farmland and cattle as well, and farm machinery. And I always tell my customers, markets are an attitude. We've said it on the podcast before. Markets are an attitude, and when the attitude's strong. So I feel like maybe the government was trying to increase the attitude, or, just like you're saying, if the attitude's strong that, hey, farming's good, we're good, and then that raises, the prices up. Whereas we haven't had that up and down cycle to where, crap, this year sucks as much. But
right. And that was an interesting comment that you made, Dr. Smith, that's one of those psychological deals behind the stock market crashing.
Yeah.
If it crashes,
sentiment, right?
Morale, just everything.
Morale, sentiment, absolutely. Yeah. And in the agriculture, in the livestock industry, if I'm not mistaken, there's like 4 big corporations that control the whole thing, right?
You are correct.
So that is the big problem, in my opinion, is the over-centralization in everything, right? And it's definitely there in agriculture. You have huge centralization in agriculture that gives a few players, too much room to try to control things for everybody else, right? And whether they have good intentions or not, I'm not going to get into that. But I do think that over-centralization is a huge part of what has got us to where we are now, and has created a lot of the risks that people aren't really thinking about enough.
Yeah. So when we want to tie the inflation topic back to our listeners' core business, and a lot are in ag business and farming themselves, I, being a banker, had the privilege, if you want to call it that, to sit through a presentation by one of the representatives of the Chicago Fed District. And she mentioned that, there's pretty strong sentiments out there that there will be 4 rate hikes in 2022,
right,
and more to come based upon, certain market standards that need to be met. Did not state whether those were going to be 0.25% hikes or if they had the opportunity to be larger, just stating that they were going to come. And I'll have you comment on that. But then also another comment that she mentioned that I thought was quite interesting is they're seeing a shift between consumer spending for goods and services away from services and more towards goods, which I assume is pandemic driven. So first start off, if you don't mind, commenting on what you might think interest rates are going to do in the next coming time period, or what they have to do in order to make this cycle start to correct itself.
Mm-hmm. Again, interest rates are going up short term, which the Fed controls, and long-term interest rates. You see each time the Fed has another meeting, their language gets stronger. So first it was 2 rate hikes in 2022, then it was 3 rate hikes, and now it's 4 rate hikes. This has been going up every month, and I think it's going to continue to go up. So yes, interest rates are going to go up, and that changes everybody's calculus, right? So if one thing you don't want to be in is debt that is floating interest rates, right? So lock in your interest rates if you can, right? I do think that in terms of the farming business and in terms of farmers, I think there's going to be less volatility in real assets than in financial assets. I think the kind of volatility that we're seeing in the markets right now is because of the liquidity that's being withdrawn from the markets, and the easy places that had to go, are the first ones to suffer. So you see, high yield bonds, you see small cap growth stocks, et cetera. Those have been correcting the most, right? But I think that there is a silver lining here for farmers in that, you do have land, you do have, real assets, right? You've got equipment, et cetera, right?
Yep.
I do think you got to be concerned if you don't own that stuff now. And I think also the silver lining is that you have pricing power. People need to eat, right? That's like that's the most fundamental need that we consumers have, is we still got to eat, right? So you already see that pricing power in the food inflation, that's happening right now. So I think that in that regard, farmers are in a better position to weather some of the changes that are happening right now than, say, technology entrepreneurs.
Right.
So Tanner and Dr. Smith, the one thing that came to my mind, we talked about political influence in interest rates in the markets, maybe dipping their toes where they shouldn't be. We're in an election year here, so I hear interest rates coming up from you, Tanner, and then I hear, politics are involved with it on the other side. It makes me think, as a simple-minded person, that surely they're not going to raise them too much, because if they do, they're going to screw themselves for any kind of political push out there. Do you think that's going to affect the rate hikes, that they're only going to do it, they're going to temperament it a little bit?
Well, my comments really shortly here is kind of alludes to what Richard said in the beginning, is the Fed is supposed to be independent of the government, and they aren't acting exactly like that today. There's no direct connection, but the Fed is supposed to handle and manage their interest rate to help control inflation, GDP, just their control of the market to help facilitate where money in, money out goes. Is that right, Dr.
And
Smith?
unemployment.
Right. Yep.
Right. So they're also targeting unemployment. I didn't know the Federal Reserve was responsible for employment in the country, but that's a big part of their factors now, and that is fundamentally political.
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
Hard to get around that, right? I would say, the Fed it's not literally part of the federal government, right? The Federal Reserve, but it's certainly a deeply symbiotic relationship. And I don't think that, the Democratic administration right now has the wiggle room that they would like to do more spending themselves, right? So you saw Joe Biden trying to find another Federal Reserve president besides Jerome Powell, right? But he ended up keeping Jerome Powell. So he needs that stability in the markets, but he also, doesn't have the free hand that he would like to have either.
I got you. Sorry to interrupt your second part of your question there.
No,
you had a second part to that.
The only point I was alluding to with her comments around more spending for goods than for services is some of our listeners looked at a way to diversify their farms away from strictly being corn and soybeans to also involving vacation stays, to also having a pumpkin patch that had creatively designed pumpkins, or the agritainment side of it, to where you could come out and pet the donkeys and see the pigs and do more touristy type items. But obviously the pandemic put a scrunch on that. If that's the right word, a scrunch. I'm going to use that. I'm going to run with that one.
Yeah, scrunch, strain, whatever.
A scrunch down on that, and it hasn't fully recovered because people are more apt, according to the presentation I sat through, people are more apt to go buy it and do it themselves now rather than to invite someone who did the service back into their home or go and experience them like they had pre-COVID.
Yep. I think it's interesting times. Look, I think it's not a great time to be having floating interest rate debt. It's not a great time to be holding a lot of cash. I think that farmers have an opportunity to really invest in their farms, have the pricing power that comes with food production and land appreciation. Bill Gates is buying all kinds of land now, right?
Yep.
So, and I think that a lot of people are, look, the wealth gap is also widening. I do think in terms of, diversification, there are some opportunities to try to service higher end customers who want more quality food. We go to a farmer's market here in our town and we pay premium prices to farmers that'll grow us fresh food and grow us, and raise fresh meat. And so I do think there's some opportunities for that, but I don't think it's a time to really get clever, overly clever, try to, be reaching for things that are speculative, because I think we're kind of moving into what I'd call a risk off environment where it's going to be much more about value and what you can really produce and deliver. And I think that's where the opportunity is right now, and less in the, speculative growth that's driven a lot of asset allocation over the last few years, especially.
So as I'm thinking like a farmer, Tanner, you might allude to this too, because you're going to be in charge of balance sheets for farmers. And I normally sell their largest asset. So the land that they own. Okay. They have machinery. Most of our farmers in central United States sell corn and beans, maybe some cattle, livestock, etc. They have a commodity they produce and then they sell it. And they're speculating on when to sell it based on what the markets are. If you, nobody's got a crystal ball here, but if inflation goes up, like they said it's going to, for our farmers, most of them are sitting in a fairly good position with the land, and the value of land is now worth 10 times what it was. So on the balance sheet, it's looking good, but they're still selling their commodities. Do they hold on to that commodity longer and try to force the price gap and wait for it to be $6-7 corn, or do they are they just ruled by whatever price they get?
Oh, here comes the crystal ball.
Should we hold our corn or should we sell it now? That's the question.
Look, I have a little different take on this question.
Yeah.
So this is where really, to me, the behavioral finance comes in.
Okay.
We tend to frame these questions as all or nothing, like should I sell or should I not? Right?
Right.
And when you frame it in black and white like that, it does crazy stuff in our head, right? It makes us start to have all these scenarios, thinking, et cetera. And this is where, and this is my focus. How do we really help people understand and manage risk? Okay. So, look, I think for real assets, for land, for commodities, the bias is still to the upside. Okay. That doesn't mean that, there's not going to be problems. I think the bias is to the upside. So, I'm buying land, for example, right? Because I don't want cash in the bank. Okay. Now, I'm not going out and saying this is like a land grab time right now, right? Prices are pretty high already. I'm paying higher than what most of the people around here paid, when they got their land. So, but it's all part of a balance, right? You have to make sure that, you can still sleep at night, right? So sell a little bit of it, decide what your bias is. Are you bullish or are you bearish on the asset long term? What's your time period? How much time do you got? You got 20 years? You're not even thinking about this stuff, right? Are you retired and you got to be out in the next 5 years? Okay, now like that is something that's more serious for you. You got to put more time and energy into answering these questions for yourself, right? And you do have to make some decisions. And yeah, look, prices are up right now. Land is up. Even commodity prices are up, right? So if you got to sell a little bit because, you've got some nice gains and you need to make sure that you can survive in 5 years without it, right? Then yeah, it's time to sell a little bit. But everybody's different. And, these kind of polarized narratives are what drive a lot of our online lives today, because they get everybody's attention. Right. And they get everybody's attention for a reason, because they start to, create all kinds of images in our minds that create like anxiety and fear and greed, right? And then we spend more time, glued to our screens. And so I think you got to be realistic. You have to think about what's your time horizon, and are you bullish or bearish? Sorry, we're all biased. Besides being bullish or bearish, right? And you got to formulate a plan, and it does require some time to think about this stuff, but you are capable of thinking about it, and you do know better than anybody else about what's going on in your life and what your assets are doing right now. And so, don't get drawn into the, all the drama of our online lives. But it is a serious time, and it is something that we have to think about more than, we might have had to a few years ago.
So a lot of the times when we are thinking about that, should I sell or should I hold on to, is it so small scale and in our own backyard? We look at what's happening in our county or where we're delivering our grain to or our livestock to. But when we go back to the topic for today about inflation, the inflation that we're experiencing right now in the United States, that's not the only place. This is happening around the world, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely, because it's been printing. It's been, government intervention, stimulus, try to keep things from crashing. So you've had this artificial repression of natural market cycles. And it's gone on longer than anybody thought it ever could. More money has had negative interest rates than in the history of interest rates.
Right.
So there's going to be some volatility and some tumult, I would say, over the next couple of years.
So when you're talking now the world's involved on this. It's not just a U.S. issue.
No, and the Federal Reserve is kind of the central bank of the world at this point. They consider global markets, not just U.S. markets anymore. They're the bankers to the world.
Yeah.
And that's the facts.
Yeah. So that's happening, and that's going to drive a lot of corporations to have higher input costs. And with higher input costs, potentially raises the price of goods. And one of those input items is
wages. Yeah.
So if you think about that, I now have to pay more for a gallon of milk. I now have to pay more for a gallon of gasoline. I'm going to go to my employer and say, I need a cost of living increase or more, because the regular cost of living increase doesn't cover it anymore. Are we at risk of seeing some higher levels of inflation because of the initial beginning of inflation?
And let's not forget geopolitical conflict, right? So we have major supply chain disruption, not just from COVID, but from tensions between the U.S. and China, U.S. and Russia. And you have, simmering conflicts now around Ukraine and Taiwan. And everybody's just not getting along so chummy as they used to in, the one world global economy. So I think there's a lot of headwinds right now that everybody needs to be, I'm not saying, go run for the hills and, bury your gold, but I definitely think there's headwinds, there's big changes, and there's a lot of factors contributing to inflation, including supply chain disruption, global conflict, wealth gaps, wages, and just what I'd call the suppression of, or the repression of, the kind of natural market cycles. And, there's a term, financial repression, that you can look it up on Wikipedia. It's an accepted thing. And it's basically when the government leverages the private sector to pay off its debts.
Right.
And I think that's the environment that we're living in right now. The government's, got as much or more debt than anyone. They got to make sure that doesn't get out of control. And so they're, leaning on the private sector to help make sure that doesn't happen. And that has consequences.
Right. And then that private sector passes on, as far down the road as it can go until the dollar runs out. But to tie this back to agriculture, I try to grab a little bit of my own information, Dave, because I know the experts can contribute a lot. So I found a Purdue University survey and put that in your notes that, according to Purdue, the poll that they did this last fall, they say that the farmer confidence is the lowest level that it has been since the 1980s, despite having higher commodity prices. So that to me was a little troubling, that our listeners right now don't feel very confident about the future of their farm or about the future of the markets that they participate in, even though we feel like we're in a pretty good standpoint right now, commodity wise.
Yeah, markets, like I said, markets are attitude, and they're saying the attitude's light. I even, not being a farmer and traveling to New York or the West Coast and go out to California, when we look at like housing prices, Tanner, in the Midwest, for your simple 3-bedroom house for a family, we're paying $250,000, and I go to the coast and you can't touch it for $1 million. And so it makes me feel like everything's cheap here, but we get paid a whole lot less. They must make a whole lot more money than we do.
Right.
So it makes me wonder, what if all prices went up to that? We don't make enough in the Midwest. Maybe that just alludes to what the farmers are thinking. Just maybe we're underpriced and over-delivered.
Right.
I did see some data too that was saying that inflation is even higher in the Midwest, like 9%. So, it's an economy that's more focused on goods rather than services. Goods have gone up more than services. The fact that services prices, especially digital services, have stayed low, has also an influence on the national inflation numbers. But when, you're really, in a goods-based economy, you're even hurt more by the supply chain disruptions and the wage increases, et cetera, right? So I think even in the Midwest, farmers are probably feeling the impacts of inflation more than, the coastal folks, even though their prices may be higher on the coast. I think their cost of living isn't going up as relatively as it is for, say, the Midwest.
We have a cost of living. Do we have a cost of farming rate that increases? Because if we did this year, all I've heard is fertilizer prices, and livestock feed and fuel, et cetera, they're all going up. So when just what Dr. Smith was talking about, we're goods-based, Tanner, in the Midwest. So although they're going up on the goods we sell, the goods that we have to put in to sell our product cost more. So our inflation may be more, but the Purdue study, alluding back to that, when I think of farmers, I just think of tradition, heritage, long-lasting, standing, century farms, etc. Do you think that people just are nervous about producing for their father, their family, I don't know what it's like in New York, but maybe it's, I lost my job, I'll go get a different one. Here it's like, I lost the family farm. Like, it's everything I had.
Yeah, there's probably a lot of emotion into that. I mean, that's what Richard was saying. I mean, and here's what I've been noticing in conversations that I've had is the 80s. You just, that's a terminology that gets used, and there's a group of farmers that didn't live through it and probably slept through it in college in their Ag Biz 101 class or whichever it was, that maybe doesn't fully understand what the 80s were all about. But all they hear is that grandpa and dad or grandma and mom don't want it to happen to their farm again. And I think it makes them nervous. So as we get ready to wrap up here, Dr. Smith, could you compare, based upon your knowledge, where we're at today, inflation-wise, compared to the late 70s and 80s, and if you see any correlation or if we're two different paths?
Well, I do think that there are some similarities to the 80s in that I think we are in a speculative bubble right now, and prices of things have gone higher than many people thought they would. And when you start to chase those prices, I think you get into the risk of those, speculative bubbles crashing. The big difference between now and the 80s is where interest rates are, right? So back in the 80s, I remember people telling me they had mortgages that were at 20%, right? Whereas right now, mortgages are at historic lows. So I think it's a similar situation where you have a lot of excess speculation. You have a lot of intervention, back in the 70s, you had the oil embargo and trying to maneuver through all that, right? And so I think you did have intervention back then, not to the degree we have it right now. But so I think that the kind of speculative excesses are still there. But I think the big difference is that interest rates were at a 40-year high back then, and they're at a 40-year low now. So that's a totally different calculus, right? Especially when it comes to debt, right? If you had floating interest rate debt back then, you were gold because your interest rate kept going down year after year. If you have floating interest rate debt now, I think your interest payments are going to be going up year after year.
And I would echo too, from my understanding of the financial network, the financial system now compared to then is much more highly regulated, and credit approval is generated on such a more scrutinized basis. So instead of it being relying on inflated asset values and loan to value, we now focus so highly on cash flow and what cash flow projections look like, along with debt to asset ratios, along with credit history. So I would state that even though rates are at their lowest, I do feel like it's harder to get a loan now than it used to be.
We talked about cycles earlier. It makes me wonder, with the digital era in the 80s, by the time you knew that you were behind,
That's true.
I get 9,000 text messages now that say, hey, did you make this payment? Did you, reminders, calendars, etc. Do you think that the digital era will somewhat help protect us or hedge against waiting too long?
Well, one thing before I let Dr. Smith contribute is I can tell you in the banking world, from what I knew about the 80s, everything was a paper file and payments were recorded on a paper ledger. So if you, the farmer, had an annual payment and we didn't pull your file to see if you'd actually made that payment, we might not have known that half of our portfolio was delinquent because we didn't look up and pull every single paper file every single day.
And now it's a click of a mouse.
And now I get a report every single morning that tells me if you're past due. So I would say it's going to help a little bit on the financial side for awareness, but it's got to help, right, Dr. Smith, for the rest of it?
There's definitely been efficiency gains from the digital economy. I wouldn't overestimate those efficiencies. I think those efficiency gains are being overestimated in the risk that people are expecting with regard to what could happen in the future, right? So
now you just know quicker.
We get complacent. We get complacent in whatever era we're living in, and I think we're in a time of complacency now. And I think that it's what we what do they say? It's not what you don't know that's gonna hurt you, but what you think you know that just ain't so. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now.
So I don't think that's a bad way to end this. So we talked a lot about inflation today, and I'll do my best to summarize it, Dave. But Dr. Smith, is there any other comments, any general comments you'd like to share with our listeners before we wrap up?
Just that I would just like to say I really appreciate the farming community. I really appreciate the farmers out there. I think that you are underappreciated, and I think that more people are starting to really recognize the value that you're adding to the economy. And I think there's a real opportunity for you to continue to bring the work that you do to the attention of the public and to let everybody know, the value that you're delivering and to innovate and create new value through today's technology world. So Great job, guys.
No, thank you so much for that. And then while we do our summary, one of the questions that we ask all of our guests before we close out is, what do you know now that you wish you'd have known sooner? So we'll close with that question after we summarize and challenge. But we talked with Dr. Richard Smith today about inflation. That was our key focus on what we've got going on. What is inflation and why should we care? So we helped define that and why it applies to agriculture. We learned that the inflation rate compared to the interest rate creates a real difference, or real rate, which would be the difference between those two. And paying attention to that will help monitor where and what this economy is going to do. We learned that the Fed is supposed to work independently from the federal government. That's Federal Reserve that we talked about. But they ultimately control monetary policy and have kind of become the central bank for the world. So the inflation we're experiencing right now in the United States is not solely just within our borders, that this is a global experience that we're sharing with a lot of our trade partners, which is potentially affecting some of those trade relationships where we sit currently. We talked a little bit about consumer appetite and consumer, maybe moods, the way to choose a word that might be driving where we're headed currently. We did a little bit of a prediction on where interest rates might be heading. The ultimate scenario is if you can't stomach the risk, you should be seeking a fixed rate. If you can do that now, we don't want to be stuck in a position of a lot of variable rate borrowings in an instance to where rates are going to be going up. We also hit a little bit on the fact that farmer confidence is down, and that might be because inflation's higher in the Midwest. But ultimately, we're in a good spot because we have a solid asset base in our land and our equipment. But to really pay attention to those margins as we look at putting our crops and our livestock to market on our own. And then ultimately just fully understanding where and how this might affect us in our entire ecosystem, knowing that our goods are potentially going to go up for cost-wise, the services are going to go up cost-wise, and our cost for production is going to go up. So just understanding how and where inflation affects you has been a part of our big mission today, Dave.
Do you think anybody just fast forwarded our podcast and just listened to your summary and they like, all right, I just did it in 5 seconds?
If they did, they need to go back.
They need to go back. If you did that, go back. I think you're right on the money. But Dr. Smith, before we ask you the question, we give a challenge as well. And my challenge after listening to all this is don't get complacent. Don't get complacent as farmers. And actually, I looked at my Facebook feed this morning and I just pulled it back up. 8 years ago on this day, I was listening to T. Boone Pickens, and he said, "A fool with a plan is better than a genius with no plan." So don't be the genius with no plan. Plan for the future. That's my challenge. So with that being said, what is something that you know now that you wish you would have known or changed if you knew previously?
I would say it's how valuable our local lives are.
I like that. That was very concise, very simple, but I think the meaning goes way beyond his words.
Way deeper. Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think we have so much more. We talked earlier about the forces of centralization. I think they've gone too far, and I think where we're at economically as a society, there's a real hunger for more local connections and valuing local more. And that's partly why I also, really think that farming, especially for, when you're connecting with your local community, has a really bright future.
Awesome. And we appreciate the time that you spent with us today. So for our listeners, if they want to learn more about what you've got going on or get information from you and insights, how could they find you or get your contact information?
drrichardsmith.com, drrichardsmith.com. And I have a newsletter you can sign up for there. You can also learn about the Foundation for the Study of Cycles. There's a link there. And like I said, I really am working on helping people be more financially literate and risk literate in particular. You have a background in banking, a bank, risk management is just table stakes. And yet it's, relatively unknown, right, when it comes to our individual financial lives. And so I'm building new technology to help the public start to integrate risk management, or like I like to say, risk design, into their decision making going forward.
Well, very
that's
good.
Great.
Well, thanks, listeners, for listening. Remember to like, rate, review our podcast. It's the Farm4Profit. Make sure to share that with your friends. Don't hesitate to share this as well. Remember, we're the Mullet of Agriculture podcast. We have the business in the front every week with Farm4Profit, and then the offshoot kind of after-hours show, Farm for Fun, which makes us the party in the back. We look forward to sharing next week with you on the Farm for Fun episode. And don't forget, we will be in Louisville. I think it says that.
Louisville.
We'll be in Louisville for the National Farm Machinery Show at the Sukup booth. Thanks for the partnership with Sukup on that one.
Yeah, we look forward to seeing everybody there. Thanks again for joining us this week. And until next time, have a good one.
Remember, if you aren't farming for profit, you won't be farming for long.
I was surprised to hear that Purdue deal. I don't think our local farmers that we know are that down in the dumps, I guess.
So I would say it's cautious optimism coming into my office for loan renewals. Is they come in and they just tell you about they just had the best yields they've ever had and they're selling it for some of the best prices, but they also know that it's going to cost so much more
to do it next year.
So they're concerned that they're going to put all their gains from this year back into the crop for next
and not make any
and not realize it.
I got you.
Mm-hmm. You just got to make sure that you don't take on costs that you didn't know, like interest rate costs, for example, if those are going up, right? And if it's variable rate, then that could really bite you. So I do think it's a time to kind of be conservative, probably take some profits if you do have some to take, sell a little land or something, and make sure you can manage the risk, because there is going to be more uncertainty than less.
Dave Knuth with Farm Credit was saying at a conference I was at the other day that they're encouraging people to stretch it out farther, which was surprising to me. Instead of a 20-year note, they'd go a 30-year note because the interest rates were the historically lowest ever. They would rather have you have the liquidity and buy more asset right now and have more hard asset land if you can afford it, but they'll stretch and minimize your payment, but then you'll have it while you lock it in. Yeah. Well, which I was like, man, what bank tells you to stretch it out farther?
That's what a bank should tell you, because they're going to generate more interest income. I mean, the longer you stress it out, the more interest income the bank gets. That's a very, in my opinion, that's a tightrope to walk. Because that's the issue, is you're telling the farmer that, yes, please keep your loan with us longer, which is ultimately going to make you cost more. But where's the balance between a shorter term rate with interest rate risk that could end up costing you more versus locking it in for a long period of time?
Yep.
You'd be in good company. That's what Ray Dalio and Bill Gates and others are doing. They're borrowing to buy real assets.
Yep.
And locking in historically low interest rates. I'm not that comfortable with that strategy myself, because I don't like being in debt. But that's what the guys who spend their lives understanding this stuff are doing.
Right.
So
Bill Gates has made a lot of farmers nervous. Would that be the word? Nervous or mad? One of the two. They want to know why. They want to know why.
Could be a lot of reasons, but to specifically know, it'd be great to be a fly on the wall of those strategic meetings.
Oh man.